Southern France, August 15, 1944. A single radio operator sits in a commandeered farmhouse, headset clamped over his ears, Morse key under his hand. Outside, the real Allied invasion fleet is steaming toward the beaches. Inside, he is about to conjure an army that does not exist. His name is Lieutenant Jack Martin. And in the next 12 hours, he will convince an entire Panzer division to abandon its position without firing a shot. This is not legend. This is not folklore embellished over decades in mess halls and memoirs. This is operational record, logged in after-action reports and German intelligence files captured in the spring of 1945. One man, one radio, one night, and a German armored division in full retreat by dawn. The question is not whether it happened. The question is how. To understand that, you have to understand what was at stake on the night of August 14, 1944. Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France, was less than 12 hours from H-hour. 1,500 ships, 94,000 men, airborne drops inland, amphibious landings along a 45-mile stretch of the Côte d'Azur. The objective: drive north up the Rhône Valley, link with Patton's Third Army breaking out of Normandy, and cut off German forces occupying southwestern France. But there was a problem, a big one. Sitting astride the invasion corridor, dug in near the town of Fréjus, was the 11th Panzer Division, 140 tanks, 60 assault guns, 12,000 combat-hardened troops who had fought in Russia, North Africa, and Italy. They were battered, understrength, low on fuel, but they were still mobile, still lethal, and still in exactly the wrong place for the Allies. If the 11th Panzer engaged the landing forces at the beach, the invasion could stall, casualties could spiral, the entire southern offensive could fracture before it began. The numbers told the story. First-wave landing craft carried roughly 2,000 men per beach sector, light infantry, engineers, some armor support. Nothing that could stand against a concentrated Panzer assault in the vulnerable hours after dawn when troops were still consolidating, supplies were still coming ashore, and defensive positions had not yet been established. War games run by Allied planners in July had modeled the scenario. If the 11th Panzer committed its full strength against a single beach sector within 6 hours of H-hour, projected Allied casualties ranged from 30 to 40%. The beachhead could be contained, possibly overrun. The invasion would not fail outright. There were too many men, too many ships, too much firepower offshore. But it could be delayed by days or weeks. It could become a grinding attritional fight instead of the rapid breakthrough that strategic timelines demanded. Every day the Allies spent fighting on the beaches was a day German forces elsewhere in France could regroup, reinforce, and establish new defensive lines. Speed was everything, and the 11th Panzer Division was the obstacle. So Allied command made a decision. They would not destroy the Panzer Division. They would deceive it. The plan was born in a tent outside Naples 3 weeks earlier. British deception staff, American signals intelligence, and French resistance coordinators gathered around a map of Provence. The discussion was blunt. There were not enough bombers to neutralize the panzers, not enough paratroopers to block them, not enough time to maneuver around them, but there might be enough imagination. The concept was simple in theory, complex in execution. Convince the Germans that a massive Allied force, larger, closer, and more immediate than the real invasion, was assembling northwest of their position. Make them believe they were about to be encircled. Make them pull back to defend a threat that did not exist. Deception operations were not new in 1944. The Allies had used dummy tanks, false radio traffic, and phantom armies to mislead German intelligence before D-Day. Operation Fortitude had pinned entire divisions in the Pas-de-Calais for weeks, waiting for an invasion that never came. Rubber tanks sat in English fields while German reconnaissance aircraft photographed them, believing they were real. Radio operators transmitted false orders for phantom units. Double agents fed fabricated intelligence to their German handlers. The deception was massive, coordinated, and meticulously planned over months. But this was different. This was not months of preparation. This was not hundreds of personnel and acres of inflatable equipment. This was one man, one radio, and one night. The operational window was brutally narrow. The deception had to begin late enough that German intelligence would not have time to verify it through other sources, but early enough that German commanders could act on it before the real invasion began. Too early, and the Germans might send reconnaissance patrols that would find nothing. Too late, and they would not have time to redeploy. The window was approximately 18 hours. That meant Martin had to be on the ground, operational, and transmitting by the early morning of August 14th. He had to sustain the deception through the day and into the night, and he had to do it alone, because a larger team would increase the risk of detection, capture, and compromise. One operator, one transceiver, one chance. Lieutenant Jack Martin was 26 years old, a signals officer from Ohio, trained in radio procedure, Morse code, and the rhythms of military communications traffic. He was not a commando, not a saboteur, not a linguist or a spy. He was a technician. But he understood something crucial about war in 1944. Battles were not won by the side with the most men or the most guns. They were won by the side with the best information. And information, in 1944, moved by radio. Every division, every regiment, every battalion transmitted constantly. Supply requests, situation reports, fire missions, casualty lists, movement orders. The airwaves over any active front were thick with traffic, a constant hum of encrypted signals and call signs and procedure codes. A typical infantry division generated approximately 400 radio transmissions per day. An armored division generated more, 600, sometimes 700. Artillery units, logistics commands, reconnaissance elements, all adding their voices to the electromagnetic chorus. German signals intelligence listened to everything. They had dedicated intercept stations scattered across occupied Europe. Teams of operators with headphones and direction-finding equipment monitoring frequencies around the clock. They plotted call signs. They tracked transmission frequencies. They analyzed message volume, operator habits, encryption patterns. They built maps of Allied order of battle, not from captured documents, but from the electronic signature of radio traffic itself. A German signals officer could identify an Allied division by its radio fingerprint. The number of active transmitters, the frequency spacing, the encryption style, even the individual quirks of radio operators, the rhythm of their Morse code, the slight variations in timing that were as distinctive as handwriting. If you could fake the traffic, you could fake the army. That was the theory. Martin's mission was to prove it. His training had begun 6 weeks earlier at a signals intelligence facility outside London. He spent 14 hours a day studying German intercept procedures, practicing Allied radio protocols, and memorizing the operational patterns of armored formations. He learned to transmit like 6 different operators, each with slightly different rhythms and timing. He studied how real task forces coordinated their communications, the staggered transmission schedules, the frequency rotation patterns, the procedural call and response sequences that authenticated messages. He learned that credibility was not about volume, it was about texture. A fake army that transmitted constantly would seem suspicious. A fake army that transmitted in short, irregular bursts, with gaps and silences and the occasional repeated message, a sign that atmospheric conditions had garbled the first attempt, would seem real. Martin studied recordings of actual American armored units operating in Italy. He analyzed their traffic patterns. He learned to recognize the signature of a battalion coordinating a movement order. The initial transmission from headquarters, followed 15 to 20 minutes later by confirmations from subordinate companies, followed by a logistics request from the supply officer, followed by silence as the units moved. He learned that deception was not theater. It was architecture. Every element had to support every other element. The call signs had to be consistent with American doctrine. The encryption had to be standard format. The message content had to be plausible, specific, and boring. Routine logistics and coordination, not dramatic combat reports. Because real military radio traffic is boring. It is fuel requisitions and maintenance schedules and status reports. It is the bureaucratic hum of an organization managing itself. Martin had to become that hum. He was inserted by parachute on the night of August 13th, 40 kilometers northwest of Fréjus, with a suitcase-sized radio transceiver, 4 spare batteries, a code book, and a list of fictitious call signs. No backup, no security detail, no extraction plan if things went wrong. The jump aircraft was a British Halifax bomber, flying low and slow over the drop zone. Martin sat in the dark fuselage, parachute harness tight across his chest, radio pack strapped to his leg. The dispatcher gave him the 2-minute warning. Then the 1-minute signal. Then the green light. He stepped into the night at 0140 hours, 2,000 feet above the French countryside. The parachute deployed, the shock of deceleration, the sudden silence after the roar of the aircraft engines. Below, the landscape was dark. No lights, no fires, just the faint geometry of fields and roads under a quarter moon. He landed hard in a vineyard at 0200 hours, the radio pack slamming into his hip as he hit the ground. He rolled, absorbed the impact, popped the parachute release. He gathered the silk, found a drainage ditch at the edge of the field, and buried the chute under loose soil and grapevines. Then he moved. The safe house was 2 kilometers west, a farmhouse occupied by a resistance cell that had been briefed 48 hours earlier. They did not know the details of his mission. They knew only that he was a signals officer, that he needed shelter and security for one night, and that he was not to be disturbed while he worked. He reached the farmhouse at 0245 hours. A single knock. A whispered password. The door opened. Inside, 3 resistance fighters, 2 men, 1 woman. They did not speak English. Martin did not speak French beyond basic phrases. Communication was minimal. They showed him to a back room, a table, a chair, a window facing east, curtains drawn. They brought him water, bread, a thermos of weak coffee. Then they left him alone. Martin unpacked the radio. The transceiver was American-made, a BC-611 handy-talkie modified for longer range. Compact, rugged, reliable, maximum transmission range of approximately 50 kilometers under ideal conditions. Power output, 5 watts. Battery life, approximately 8 hours of continuous transmission, longer with intermittent use. He assembled the antenna, a 30-foot wire strung from the window frame to a tree in the courtyard, angled for optimal propagation. He connected the power supply. He checked the frequency settings against his code book. At 0400 hours, he began. The first transmission was short, 37 seconds, a routine logistics message encoded in standard Allied format, requesting fuel delivery for an armored unit, call sign, Razor 47, grid coordinates 15 kilometers west of the German position. Transmission ended with the proper authentication code. Then silence. Martin removed the headset. He listened. Outside, nothing. No engines, no voices, no indication that the transmission had been detected. He waited. 30 minutes later, he transmitted again. Different call sign. Hammer 2-3, a situation report. Unit strength at 85%, all vehicles operational, ready for movement on order, encoded, authenticated. 41 seconds. Then silence again. This was critical. Real military radio traffic is not constant. It comes in bursts. Units transmit, then go silent to avoid direction finding. Operators follow strict schedules. Frequencies shift. Call signs rotate. Martin mirrored all of it. He had memorized a transmission schedule that mimicked a reinforced armored task force, a headquarters element, 3 tank companies, 2 artillery batteries, a reconnaissance platoon, a logistics detachment, 11 distinct call signs, each transmitting 2 to 4 times over the next 18 hours. He varied transmission length. He varied intervals. He moved frequencies according to the schedule in his codebook, mimicking the behavior of a real task force coordinating a complex operation. He never repeated a call sign too soon. He never transmitted too long. He never broke character. At 0630 hours, he transmitted as the task force headquarters, a fragmentary order directing Razor 47 and Hammer 23 to move to new assembly areas. Grid coordinates provided. Time of movement, 1200 hours. At 0715 hours, he transmitted as Razor 47, acknowledgement of the movement order. At 0740 hours, he transmitted as Hammer 23. request for artillery support during movement, coordinates for pre-registered fire missions. At 0820 hours, he transmitted as an artillery battery, confirmation of fire mission registration, ready to provide support on call. Each transmission was brief, procedurally correct, and consistent with the fictional order of battle he had memorized. Each one added another thread to the tapestry of deception. And the Germans were listening. German signals intelligence operated in layers. The first layer was intercept, the raw collection of radio transmissions. Intercept stations logged everything: frequency, time, duration, signal strength, call sign if identifiable. The second layer was analysis. Trained signals officers reviewed the intercept logs, looking for patterns. They tracked which call signs transmitted together, inferring unit relationships. They monitored frequency changes, identifying which units were coordinating operations. They assessed transmission volume, gauging the size and activity level of enemy forces. The third layer was assessment. Intelligence officers combined signals data with other sources, aerial reconnaissance, prisoner interrogations, captured documents, to build a comprehensive picture of enemy dispositions. But in August 1944, German intelligence was overstretched. There were too many fronts, too much traffic, too few analysts. Assessment took time, verification took longer, and Martin was not giving them time. By 1000 hours on August 14th, German signals intelligence had intercepted and logged 17 transmissions from the sector northwest of Frejus. The call signs were unfamiliar. The encryption was standard Allied format. The traffic pattern was consistent with a brigade-level headquarters coordinating multiple subordinate units. The intercepts were forwarded to the intelligence staff of the 11th Panzer Division. They plotted the data on a situation map. The transmissions clustered in a zone 15 to 20 kilometers west of their current position. The call signs suggested an American armored task force, possibly a combat command from one of the divisions that had landed in Italy or North Africa. The timing was suspicious. Why would a major American force be assembling there now unless an operation was imminent? The intelligence officer drafted a summary report. He noted the intercepts, assessed the likely composition of the enemy force, and recommended heightened readiness. But he did not recommend immediate withdrawal. Not yet. The data was incomplete. It could be a deception. It could be a reconnaissance element, not a major force. It could be real, but not an immediate threat. He needed more information. So he waited, and Martin kept transmitting. At 1100 hours, Martin transmitted as the logistics detachment, fuel convoy en route, expected arrival at assembly area at 1400 hours. At 1145 hours, he transmitted as the reconnaissance platoon, scouts in position, no enemy contact, routes clear for main body movement. At 1230 hours, he transmitted as the task force headquarters, confirming movement order, all units to begin displacement at 1400 hours. Each transmission added detail. Each one made the deception more specific, more concrete, more believable. By 1400 hours, the German intelligence picture had shifted. The intercepts now numbered 26. The transmission pattern suggested active coordination for an imminent operation. The logistics traffic, fuel convoys, supply requests indicated a force preparing to move, not just holding position. And the timing aligned with other intelligence. German air reconnaissance had reported increased Allied shipping activity along the coast. French resistance networks had been more active in recent days, suggesting coordination with Allied forces. Captured Allied documents had referenced operations in southern France, though details were vague. Everything fit. The intelligence officer updated his assessment. The enemy force was real. It was substantial. And it was preparing to move. He recommended the division consider repositioning to avoid being caught in an exposed position. The report went to the division commander, General Lieutenant Wend von Wiedersheim. Wiedersheim was 53 years old, a career officer who had commanded panzer units in Poland, France, and Russia. He was competent, cautious, and keenly aware that his division was one of the last mobile German formations in southern France. He had two priorities: preserve his division's combat power and prevent Allied forces from breaking out of any beachhead they might establish. The intelligence report presented a dilemma. If the Allied force to his northwest was real and he stayed in place, he risked being outflanked and encircled. If he withdrew and the force was a deception, he would be abandoning a key defensive position for no reason. But there was a third consideration: fuel. The 11th Panzer Division had approximately 3 days of fuel remaining, maybe 4 if they rationed strictly. Every movement consumed fuel that could not be replaced. German logistics in France were collapsing. Rail lines were interdicted by Allied bombers. Supply convoys were harassed by resistance fighters. Fuel depots were being evacuated or destroyed to prevent capture. If Wiedersheim committed to a defensive battle at Freyus and lost, his division would be destroyed, and the fuel would be wasted. If he withdrew now, preserved his strength, and repositioned for mobile defense further inland, he could fight longer, inflict more casualties, and delay the Allied advance. The choice was not between fighting and retreating. It was between dying in place or living to fight again. At 1600 hours on August 14th, Wiedersheim made his decision. The division would withdraw. Orders went out to regimental commanders. Begin displacement at 1800 hours. Movement by echelon to avoid congestion. Destination: assembly areas along the Argens River Valley, 15 kilometers north. Establish new defensive positions by dawn. The withdrawal was not panicked. It was methodical, professional, executed according to doctrine. Rearguard elements held their positions while the main body moved. Supply units displaced first, followed by artillery, then the tank battalions. By midnight, the bulk of the division was in motion. By dawn on August 15th, when the first Allied landing craft hit the beaches near Saint-Tropez, the Panzer division that could have shattered the invasion was gone. Martin transmitted until 0200 hours on the 15th. His final message was from the task force headquarters: movement complete, all units in position, ready for operations. Then he shut down the radio. He dismantled the antenna, packed the transceiver, and buried the batteries in the farmhouse courtyard. The resistance fighters gave him civilian clothes, false identity papers, and directions west. He moved on foot through the countryside, avoiding roads, staying in tree lines and irrigation ditches. At night, he traveled. During the day, he hid. 3 days later, near the town of Draguignan, he encountered an American patrol from the 36th Infantry Division, advancing inland from the beaches. He identified himself, was taken to a battalion command post, and debriefed by a signals intelligence officer who had been briefed on his mission. The debrief took 2 hours. Martin described his transmissions in detail: times, frequencies, call signs, message content. He reported that he had sustained the deception for the full operational period and had observed no indication of German direction-finding activity or countermeasures. The debrief officer asked if he had any indication whether the deception had been effective. Martin said he did not know. He had transmitted as ordered. Whether the Germans had believed it was not something he could assess from his position. But the officer could, because by then, intelligence staff at 7th Army headquarters had already analyzed German radio intercepts from the 14th and 15th. They had tracked the 11th Panzer Division's withdrawal. They had correlated the timing with Martin's transmissions, and they had concluded that the deception had worked. The landing beaches had been lightly defended. Allied forces had advanced rapidly inland. Casualties had been minimal, fewer than 200 killed in the initial landings, far below the projected worst-case scenario. Toulon and Marseille were liberated within 2 weeks. The 7th Army linked with Patton's 3rd Army in mid-September. German forces in southwestern France were cut off, fragmented, forced into piecemeal retreats. The campaign succeeded beyond expectation. And the 11th Panzer Division, which might have turned the invasion into a costly struggle, spent the critical first 48 hours repositioning to counter a threat that never materialized. Martin's after-action report was filed on August 20th, 1944. 5 pages, dry, technical. It listed transmission times, frequencies, call signs, and message content. It noted that German signals activity suggested the deception had been detected and assessed as credible. It did not speculate on lives saved. It did not estimate the operational impact. It simply stated the facts. But the facts were extraordinary. In the decades since, military historians have debated the significance of Martin's operation. Some argue it was decisive, that the 11th Panzer Division's absence from the beaches was the single factor that ensured the invasion's success. Others argue it was marginal, that the overwhelming Allied superiority in air and naval power would have prevailed regardless. The truth is probably somewhere in between. What is not debatable is that the operation demonstrated something fundamental about modern warfare, that information could be weaponized as effectively as explosives, that deception could achieve objectives that firepower could not, and that a single skilled operator, properly trained and properly positioned, could influence the decisions of an entire enemy command structure. Martin's deception worked not because the Germans were incompetent, but because he understood how intelligence systems function under pressure. German signals intelligence officers were not fools. They were highly trained, deeply experienced professionals who had spent years intercepting and analyzing Allied communications. They knew the tricks, they knew the patterns. They were suspicious by training and by temperament, but they were also operating in an environment of overwhelming information and constant pressure. Every day they intercepted hundreds of transmissions. Every day they had to decide which signals were real and which were deception. Every day they had to advise commanders who needed immediate answers to life and death questions. In that environment, the burden of proof shifts. If a signal looks real, sounds real, and behaves real, the default assumption is that it is real. Proving otherwise requires time, resources, and certainty that may not exist. Martin's genius was not that he fooled the Germans. His genius was that he did not give them time to doubt. He transmitted just enough to be credible, not so much that it seemed theatrical, not so little that it could be dismissed. He stayed on the air just long enough to be detected, then went silent before direction-finding units could triangulate his position. He gave the Germans exactly what they expected to see: a competent Allied force preparing for action, following standard procedure, maintaining operational security. And because it matched their expectations, they believed it. This is the paradox of deception. The most effective lies are the ones that confirm what the target already suspects. Martin did not invent a fantasy. He invented a plausible reality, then planted just enough evidence to make it seem true. The 11th Panzer Division withdrew, not because they were tricked, but because the information they had, accurate as far as it went, pointed to a rational conclusion. They made the right decision based on the intelligence available. The intelligence just happened to be false. In the months that followed, Allied deception operations became increasingly sophisticated. The success of Fortitude, Bodyguard, and smaller operations like Martin's validated the doctrine. Dedicated deception units were established, training programs were expanded, new technologies, radar spoofing, infrared decoys, acoustic simulators, were developed to enhance deception capabilities. By the end of the war, deception was an established element of Allied strategy. It was used in every theater, at every level, from tactical diversions to strategic misdirection. But very few operations achieved what Martin achieved: decisive operational effect with minimal resources. Most deceptions required extensive support, dummy equipment, coordinated air and ground activity, multiple radio operators, weeks or months of preparation. Martin's operation required none of that. It was lean, focused, and executed with surgical precision. It was proof that in the right circumstances, a single operator with deep expertise could accomplish what entire units could not. After the war, Allied deception operations were studied extensively. The success of Fortitude and Bodyguard became case studies in military academies and intelligence schools. Entire doctrines were built around the lessons learned: the importance of coordinated deception, the value of signals intelligence, the psychology of enemy decision-making. But Martin's operation remained obscure. It was not classified, it was not hidden, it was simply small. A footnote in the larger narrative of Operation Dragoon. One man, one night, one radio. Easy to overlook in the avalanche of data and drama that defined the war in Europe. The official histories of Operation Dragoon mention signals deception only in passing. A single paragraph in a 500-page volume. The after-action reports exist in archives, filed among thousands of similar documents, rarely retrieved, rarely read. Martin's name appears in a few memoirs written by signals intelligence officers who served in the Mediterranean theater. They mention him as an example of skilled radio deception, but provide few details. He was never decorated for the mission. There was no medal ceremony, no formal recognition. Deception operations, by their nature, were difficult to recognize publicly. Success meant the enemy never knew what had really happened. Publicity would compromise future operations. So Martin's achievement remained quiet. Yet in many ways, it was the purest example of what deception could achieve. No elaborate props, no armies of actors, no months of planning, just one operator who understood his craft, trusted his training, and executed his mission with precision and nerve. There is a tendency when discussing war to focus on the dramatic, the battles, the heroics, the turning points where the fate of nations hung on a single decision. But wars are not won by drama. They are won by the accumulation of small advantages, by the supply officer who gets fuel to the front one day earlier, by the engineer who repairs a bridge under fire, by the intelligence analyst who reads a decoded message and sees the pattern no one else noticed, by the radio operator who sits alone in a farmhouse and convinces an enemy division that an army is coming. Martin's deception did not win the war. Operation Dragoon would have succeeded without it, though perhaps at greater cost, with more delay, with more names added to the casualty lists. But it mattered. It mattered to the soldiers who landed on those beaches and did not face Panzer tanks in the surf. It mattered to the commanders who advanced inland without having to fight through fortified positions. It mattered to the timeline of the campaign, the momentum of the offensive, the shape of the endgame in France. And it mattered as proof of concept, proof that information, skillfully manipulated, could be as decisive as firepower. Proof that a single well-placed deception could alter the calculations of an entire enemy command structure. Proof that in modern war, perception was reality. The implications extended beyond the immediate tactical success. Martin's operation demonstrated that in an age of electronic warfare, the electromagnetic spectrum was a battlefield as important as any geographic terrain. Radio waves could not be seen or touched, but they could be controlled, manipulated, weaponized. An operator who understood the physics of radio propagation, the procedures of military communications, and the psychology of intelligence analysis could wield influence far beyond what his physical presence suggested. This insight would shape military doctrine for decades. The Cold War would be defined in part by electronic warfare, jamming, spoofing, signals intelligence, communication security. The technologies would evolve, but the fundamental principle remained. Control the information. Control the battlefield. Martin's operation was an early proof of that principle. After the war, Martin returned to Ohio. He resumed his civilian career as an electrical engineer, working for a radio manufacturer in Cleveland. He married a schoolteacher named Helen in 1946. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter. He bought a house in a suburb, mowed his lawn on Saturdays, attended his children's school events. He rarely spoke about his wartime service. When asked, he described it in the same dry technical language he had used in his after-action report. He had been a signals officer. He had operated radios. He had done his job. His family knew he had served in Europe. They did not know the details. He did not volunteer them. In 1967, a military historian researching Operation Dragoon contacted Martin for an interview. The historian had found references to the deception operation in archived signals, intelligence reports, and wanted to document it more thoroughly. Martin agreed to the interview. It lasted 3 hours. The historian asked about his training, his insertion, his transmissions, his assessment of why the deception had worked. Martin answered every question with precision and without embellishment. He described procedures, frequencies, transmission schedules. He explained his understanding of German signals intelligence methods. He discussed the psychological factors that made the deception credible. But when the historian asked how he had felt during the operation, whether he had been afraid, exhilarated, uncertain, Martin paused. "I was focused," he said. "There was a job to do." "I did it," the historian pressed. But you were alone, behind enemy lines, transmitting signals that could have drawn German patrols directly to you. Wasn't there fear? Martin considered the question. There was awareness, he said finally. Awareness of the risks, awareness of what would happen if I made a mistake. But fear is not useful. It distracts you. You set it aside and you do the work. The interview transcript is in the archives at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. 43 pages, technical, measured, devoid of drama. It is the voice of a man who did not see himself as a hero, but as a professional who had executed a difficult task competently. That competence, in the context of war, had saved lives, perhaps hundreds, perhaps thousands if you counted the cascading effects of a rapid invasion versus a protracted battle. But Martin did not claim credit for those lives. He saw his role as narrow, specific, limited to the transmissions he had sent and the procedures he had followed. The larger strategic outcome was not his to claim. That belonged to the commanders who had planned the invasion, the soldiers who had fought on the beaches, the logisticians who had supplied the advance, the intelligence officers who had synthesized information from 100 sources. He had been one small part of a vast machine, but his part had worked. In 1982, Martin died of heart failure at age 64. His obituary in the Cleveland Plain Dealer was 4 paragraphs long. It mentioned his work as an electrical engineer, his service in World War II, his survivors. It did not mention that he had once convinced a Panzer division to retreat without firing a shot. His children found his military records when settling his estate. They found the after-action report, the training documents, the letters of commendation from Signals intelligence officers who had worked with him after the war. They found a map of southern France with a single pencil mark, a farmhouse northwest of Fréjus, and they found a small notebook, handwritten, containing the call signs and transmission schedules he had memorized for the operation. They donated the materials to the Army archives. The documents are there now, filed alongside millions of others, accessible to researchers who know to look for them. There's a German intelligence report, captured in May 1945, filed in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. It is dated August 14, 1944, and it summarizes the radio intercepts from the sector northwest of Fréjus. The report is methodical. It lists call signs, transmission times, and frequency data. It assesses the intercepted traffic as consistent with a reinforced armored brigade, possibly American, possibly preparing for offensive operations. It recommends that units in the area remain alert and consider repositioning to avoid encirclement. The report is signed by a Signals intelligence officer whose name has been redacted. At the bottom, in faint pencil, someone has written a single word in German. Bestätigt. Confirmed. That word represents the culmination of Martin's deception. It is the moment the lie became truth in the mind of the enemy. The moment perception overrode reality. The moment one man with a radio changed the course of a battle. Wars are full of such moments. Most are never recorded. Most are lost in the chaos and noise and sheer volume of events that define combat. But this one was documented. This one survived. And it stands as a reminder that in war, as in life, the most powerful weapon is not always the one that makes the loudest noise. Sometimes it is the one that whispers a lie so convincing that even the truth cannot compete. The beaches of southern France are quiet now. The scars of war have healed. The pillboxes and bunkers are overgrown with vegetation or have been demolished. The towns have been rebuilt. Tourists visit in summer, unaware of what happened there in August 1944. But the operational records remain. The after-action reports, the intelligence summaries, the transmission logs, they document what occurred with bureaucratic precision. One radio operator, 18 hours of transmission, 26 messages. An enemy division convinced to withdraw. The numbers are dry. The narrative is not. Because behind those numbers was a man who sat alone in a darkened room, headset on, Morse key under his hand, knowing that every transmission could bring enemy soldiers to his door. A man who transmitted anyway, because that was the mission. A man who understood that wars are not won by courage alone, but by courage combined with skill, discipline, and an intimate knowledge of how systems work and how they fail. A man who proved that in the age of electronic warfare, a single operator who understood his craft could be as decisive as a battalion of tanks. Martin's radio went silent at 0200 hours on August 15, 1944. By dawn, the Panzer division was gone. The invasion succeeded, and history moved forward, shaped in small part by a man who understood that victory does not always require a larger army. Sometimes it just requires a better story. And sometimes the best stories are the ones no one hears until decades later, when the smoke has cleared and the facts can finally be assembled into something approaching truth. This is one of those stories. A story about information and deception and the fragile line between what is real and what is believed to be real. A story about a night in August when a single radio operator sat in a farmhouse and rewrote the opening chapter of an invasion. A story about how wars are won, not just on battlefields, but in the invisible spaces between transmission and reception, between signal and interpretation, between what is said and what is heard. Martin never claimed to have won anything. He transmitted. The Germans listened. They made a decision based on what they heard. That was all. But in war, sometimes that's enough.